Hi, my name is Jill Stoddart. I'm a senior manager with Amazon Web Services, and I'm joined today by Michael Mattis, who's one of our great solution architects. Thanks for spending some time with us today. We're going to talk about how you can migrate your Microsoft applications to AWS. So today we'll go over some of the reasons why customers are choosing AWS for their Microsoft applications, and then Mike will take you through how to think about and plan your migration. And I'll end with walking through some of your licensing options for bringing those Microsoft licenses to AWS or getting them directly from us. Okay, so let's talk about why customers do choose AWS for their Microsoft workloads. And the first thing I'd like to do is share a quote from our CEO, Andy Jassy, who likes to say that there's no compression algorithm for experience. And for Windows workloads, that really rings true because we have the most experience with Windows workloads in the public cloud. We've been running Windows workloads for over 10 years. And we've had so many customers like Adobe and Autodesk, General Electric, Pitney Bowes, so many who have run their business critical Windows workloads built on SQL Server, .NET, Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, Dynamics, all different types. Some of the reasons why they like it so much really has to do with our global reach and our most highly available architecture. So I want to make sure we're all clear about what an AWS region is. There is a lot of confusion in the marketplace about what different cloud providers call a region. What AWS has as a region is always made up of multiple physically separate data centers called availability zones. Each one of these availability zones runs on a distinct power grid to provide a high degree of disaster protection for high availability. So we have 18 of these regions made up with 54 different availability zones. We also have more security certifications than any other compliance certifications than any other cloud provider. One of the most commonly referred to reasons for choosing AWS as well is just our ability to innovate and our obsession with customers. We have now over 100 different service offerings, and in 2017 launched more than 1,400 new innovations. For Microsoft workloads, in particular the SQL Server, we hear over and over from customers how their performance improves when they migrate these workloads from on-premises to AWS. And finally, customers are also able to improve their TCO. And one of the things that AWS is really focused on is wherever possible, we try to do price reductions, and we've done 65 of these since 2006. When we look at, as I mentioned, we've had Windows on AWS since 2008, and over this time, we've been doing a lot of innovations. Some of the most current ones are in our serverless Lambda architecture in a service. We released .NET Core 2.0 earlier this year. So we just have a whole array of features and services that we've launched that will help you not just lift and shift your Microsoft applications, but also quickly modernize these applications using open source tools such as SQL Server on Linux and our .NET Core on Lambda, and in some of our other development tools such as X-Ray. Of course, we have a whole set of over 89 different instance types and across 22 families. We have many different Windows versions as well that we can support. So an AMI is an Amazon machine image, and these are prepackaged versions for you of the Windows and SQL Server software. We go all the way back to, you can get Windows Server 2003 and SQL Server 2005. And of course, if you want to get the software that you're used to running on premises, we have in our AWS Marketplace over 750 different listings. So when we're going to be talking about migration today, and when we look at how customers migrate, we see kind of three different big categories. The first one on the left here is customers who are doing new innovation and using AWS as their innovation platform. The second category is customers like Edwards Lifescience and Capital One who are going all in on AWS and bringing, doing everything that they can in the AWS cloud. A third migration pattern that we see is bringing over some of these corporate IT workloads that maybe some of you are thinking about bringing. So for example, SharePoint is an application that many of you probably have lots of customizations and doesn't easily migrate to Office 365 with those customizations. We see customers like these shown here bringing those over to AWS and being able to run things like their SharePoint, like their Active Directory and Microsoft Dynamics software on AWS. So Mike, I'm going to ask you now to spend some time talking about how would you plan to migrate some of your Microsoft applications to AWS?
Hi, everybody. This is Mike Mattis. Thanks for the introduction, Jill. Now I'll lead you through what I've seen most customers do in terms of a logical planning, order of operations, and migrating their Microsoft applications to AWS. So there's 4 simple steps to migrating your Microsoft applications to AWS. The first step is to create a landing zone. The second step in the process is to move your database tier. The third step is to migrate the application. The application generally depends on the database tier. And then the fourth step, after you've migrated both your database tier and your application, then you can roll over to production, and that's step 4. So when I mention the landing zone, it's actually a bunch of different things. The landing zone in AWS parlance is the account structure, okay? And for most of our customers, whether they're small startups or large enterprises, they're going to have multiple AWS accounts. And so a landing zone includes the proper account structure such that you may have an AWS account for dev, an AWS account for production, a security account for logging. Okay, all of these things go in the landing zone. There's also the networking and VPC construct. Certainly some customers want to keep their development and test environments isolated from production. And so the landing zone construct allows the customer to have, we'll say, complete control and automation, I should say, over the networking configuration of their VPCs. The landing zone also includes a security apparatus. That security apparatus could be a common login infrastructure, things such as CloudTrail, CloudWatch logs. Okay, and this can be common across all AWS accounts in the customer's enterprise. And then, of course, Active Directory. Almost all Microsoft applications, whether they're built in-house or commercial Microsoft software products, rely on Active Directory for authentication. Okay, so the landing zone can include Active Directory, and with that, there's a couple different options for running Active Directory on AWS. There's certainly the option to extend your Active Directory domain into AWS by deploying, our Windows AMIs running on EC2 instances. Okay, you can configure those EC2 instances to be domain controllers joined to your Active Directory domain. So the VPCs would include subnets that are just an extra Active Directory site that are part of your Active Directory domain. And then there's the option to run Microsoft Managed Active Directory. This is an Active Directory that would have an established trust with your Active Directory domain, and AWS manages and maintains the high availability of that Active Directory domain, and we give you delegated ability to create user accounts, computer objects, reset passwords, much like you do on premises today. So when we look at the common customer constructs around creating their Active Directory design in the VPC, most customers start off in a single Amazon region, and within that single region, there will be a single VPC. And as AWS recommends to all of our customers, we suggest that they design for high availability and the best way to design for high availability in AWS is to deploy your application across multiple availability zones. So we suggest that customers, if they're extending their Active Directory into AWS, they deploy a domain controller in at least 2 availability zones. So this diagram here is representing at least 1 domain controller in availability zone A and at least 1 domain controller in availability zone B. That virtual private gateway is an IPsec VPN tunnel that extends back to the customer's on-premises environment, such that Active Directory domains that are in AWS can be fully replicated and an extension of the existing customer's Active Directory domain. Some of our larger customers often choose to deploy multiple VPCs with Active Directory domain controllers in them. And there are multiple reasons for doing that, one of which is some of our larger customers may have hundreds or even thousands of AWS accounts. And with VPC peering allows you to peer VPCs within AWS to up to 125 other VPCs. And so customers horizontally scale that by deploying domain controllers and multiple VPCs and then peering those VPCs with other applications or systems that they're deploying in AWS. And so in this particular diagram, you can see that the customer is deploying Active Directory and multiple VPCs, and then they're pairing these Active Directory domain controller VPCs with one another, such that Active Directory can replicate and all domain controllers can have the full set of objects, computer objects, user objects, and all other objects that are resident in their Active Directory domain. And still, other customers may have a presence in more than one Amazon region. And in that case, they can deploy their Active Directory domain controllers in an AWS region on the left-hand side, AWS Region 1, and they can deploy in more than one Amazon region over on the right-hand side. Now, the inter-region connectivity as referenced in the diagram could mean multiple things. As we announced at reInvent 2017, we have the capability to do VPC peering cross-region. We also have the capability to allow customers to set up their own IPsec VPN tunnel to encrypt data over the public network such that they can have their domain controllers in multiple AWS regions communicate securely. And as common with previous diagrams, this shows that there is a VPN tunnel going back to the customer's on-premises network. So everything is encrypted between the customer's environment and AWS. So now that we have the landing zone and we have Active Directory deployed in AWS, the next step towards building out the migration to AWS for the customer's Windows applications is to deploy or migrate the database tier of the application. Now with database tiers, as Jill mentioned earlier, we have many AMIs that are available that run Windows Server as well as SQL Server. If the customer's application supports it, one common design pattern that we have is using Amazon Relational Database Service, RDS. That's a managed relational database service that Amazon offers for our customers. And we have SQL Server as one of those relational databases. So customers can use Amazon RDS as a relational database backend for their Microsoft applications. Or if their application is not yet ready to be run as a managed service, the database tier, they could certainly deploy SQL Server on top of EC2, and then they would manage it just as they would in-house today. Now, when they're taking their existing database and migrating it to AWS, they have to identify a database replication and synchronization strategy. Okay, is it going to be a big bang migration, which is suitable for smaller databases and good connectivity? Or are they going to be looking at larger databases where they may have to do like a full backup and a recovery and then differential? Okay, and then others may require zero downtime depending on the criticality of the application. And for those, they may want to use a software-based tool to do that type of replication. So when we look at the options for deploying SQL Server on AWS, as I mentioned before, Amazon RDS for SQL Server, it's a managed relational database service. AWS is responsible for facilities, OS install, patching, database maintenance, maintaining the availability of the SQL Server itself. Okay, the customer is responsible for the data that goes into the relational database. If the customer's application is not yet ready to move to that managed scenario, the customer could certainly install SQL Server running on top of Windows in EC2, and then the customer themselves are responsible for maintaining the patching of the operating system, the version of the SQL Server instance, the patching of the database, the backups, and as well as the high availability. When we talk about customers migrating their SQL Server databases to AWS, there's a multitude of options that are available. There's the simple backup and restore. This is similar to going into SQL Server Management Studio, right-clicking, backing up a database. It backs it up as a .bak file, and then you can restore it once you've moved that BAK file to where it needs to go. There's also the option to do an import-export or a bulk copy. There's also SQL Server log shipping. One of the more interesting scenarios that we have represented here on the diagram is AWS DMS. Now I'll talk about that in a little bit. As you can see, that also provides the availability or the option of having minimal, and when I say minimal, I'm thinking seconds to minutes, downtime for customers when they migrate their data to AWS. AWS DMS, Database Migration Service, you can think of it as a tool to replicate your data from on-premises to AWS, AWS to on-premises, or AWS to AWS. Okay, it's able to connect to an instance that runs in AWS or a database that runs on-premises as a source, and the target can either be on-premises, it can be in EC2, or it can be in Amazon RDS. So database migration service is just simply a means to replicate data from source to target, and it does not differentiate whether the source or target runs in AWS or elsewhere. So we've seen customers go through this modernization, migration, and replication stage where they're looking to maybe migrate from a commercial to an open source database. They may be looking to migrate to Amazon Aurora, or they might be upgrading to a minor version, say going from SQL Server 2012 Service Pack 1 to SQL Server 2012 Service Pack 2. When they migrate, they're looking to migrate maybe from EC2 Classic to VPC. They may be consolidating databases, multiple databases into a single database, or they're consolidating shards into Amazon Aurora, or they're migrating business critical applications to provide greater availability for their applications. And then the replication strategy, they may create cross-region replicas to ensure that their mission critical systems are available to customers no matter where they are. So how does AWS DMS work? So in this diagram, what you're seeing is the application users are accessing their application, and the application is running on customer premises today. DMS is a replication instance that started up. It connects to the source and the target databases. You, as the AWS user, select the tables, schemas, or databases that are choose to replicate from source to target. DMS will then create the tables, load the data, and keep the replication in sync between source and target. And then once you've identified that the application or the database is fully migrated over, you can simply flip the switch in terms of lowering the TTL value in your DNS records or other migration strategies to migrate your users seamlessly, often without them knowing, to the target database. Now, once the database is migrated to AWS, you can then migrate the front end or the user-facing tier of the application. In this particular diagram, we're choosing a three-tier application. You can think of this as SharePoint, for example, where there's web servers, there's app servers, and then there's SQL servers behind it. So you've already got your domain controllers and your SQL servers running in AWS. Once you've done that, you can then build out your web tier, okay, or your user-facing tier. The options for that include a manual migration. Okay, you can build new servers on top of EC2, migrate your application that way. Tool-based migration, so you can think of this as a block-level migration. You could also use AWS import-export to do essentially a backup or a VM import of whatever you're running on premises today into AWS. And then, of course, once you've done that, whether it's a manual build or a backup and recovery or a block-level build, you can perform extensive testing. Okay, that's the other advantage of AWS, is if you need more capacity, it's at the API call. All you have to do is go into the AWS console or go to the command line, and you can start up a new EC2 instance, or three EC2 instances, or as many EC2 instances as you want. And you can maintain rollback capability too. That's a nice feature. We have EBS snapshots. So if you're deploying a patch or you need to test something, you can take a snapshot. If you need to recover from that, you can restore that snapshot back to its original state. And then once you've done your extensive testing, as I mentioned before, you can plan your production cutover. Okay, this would include making sure that all the data is up to date between your source and target on premises and AWS. You can test your cutover mechanism, whether it's dropping down the time to live value on your DNS records from 2 minutes to 5 seconds to 3 seconds. Okay, and then of course, you want to make sure that you always have a rollback scenario. Not every migration goes seamlessly, and you want to make sure that you have proper backout procedures. And you can test that along the way too, so that you're not caught off guard if you're making a cutover and the cutover doesn't go as expected. Now I'll turn it back over to Jill, and she'll walk you through some of the licensing options for running Microsoft products on AWS.
Mike, thanks so much for taking us through that migration. What I'd like to do now is spend some time talking about licensing options that you have on AWS. So let's just set out some basics about Microsoft licensing. So on premises today, you're familiar with having your the server software licenses. These are on premises and require a number of identifiable cores or processors. And each of these licenses gets assigned to a physical server. So how do you do that Microsoft licensing in the public cloud? Because of course, the public cloud is generally going to be a multi-tenant environment, meaning the same physical server is going to host multiple customers. So when you utilize, one way to utilize Windows licenses in the public cloud is to get the license from the public cloud provider. And AWS is a Microsoft Gold partner, and we can provide those licenses. Now, what's also going to be interesting as we go through this today is that we're also an authorized license mobility partner. And so I'm also going to show you, in addition to getting licenses from AWS, how you can bring those licenses to AWS. You have two different options for how to use Microsoft licenses on AWS. The first one is you can get these licenses, both Windows Server and SQL Server, directly from AWS on a pay-as-you-go basis. If you're on running instances on EC2, we also offer the option to bring your own licenses to AWS. And here I will go over how you can bring licenses onto our default tenancy through license mobility, as well as how to bring Windows Server onto dedicated hosts and licenses without software assurance onto our dedicated tenancy. So let's start looking at what are some of those advantages of getting your licenses from AWS. Of course, the big one here is that you pay as you go. You pay per virtual machine or per instance, and you pay per hour. AWS, then, we manage that Windows image for you. which one of the benefits here is not only do we do the patching, but by paying as you go, you can reduce your Microsoft Enterprise Agreement commitments or eliminate it altogether. When you license from AWS, you do not need any additional client access licenses or CALs. That is already included. Again, simplifying your licensing. And of course, one of the things you have to worry about when you have licenses on premises is how are you going to get the upgrade? Do you need to pay for software assurance, or do you need to pay for an upgrade? With AWS, you pay the same price regardless of what software version you're using of Windows Server. And the same is true when you buy SQL Server Standard Edition. It doesn't matter which version you have. Same price. And best of all, you're no longer responsible for any of that tracking for true-ups and licensing compliance and the dreaded audit. So those are some of the advantages of getting the licenses from AWS. Now let's talk about how you can bring licenses, your own licenses, to AWS. Many of you, as you're thinking about this migration, already have those licenses on premises, and you want to know how you can leverage that investment when you migrate to AWS. Another big concern I hear from customers is, do I have all these older versions of Windows Server or SQL Server, and I don't want to have to do an upgrade when I migrate that application. Well, you don't need to do that. You can bring those straight over to AWS. And you can also import your entire existing image to the AWS cloud. So before I go further discussing how you do this, I want to go over some basics about EC2 instances. The first concept is what we call a default tenancy instance. This is what you're probably most associate with EC2. These are multi-tenant servers, and each server, physical server, hosts different customers. AWS decides which host your instance is going to run on, and you're going to be paying, again, per instance. AWS also offers what we call a dedicated instance. A dedicated instance is single tenant. That means only one AWS account is using the physical server at any time. We at AWS still determine which host, when you launch an instance, the instance will run on. And you still pay per instance, and then there's one hourly fee per region. No matter how many dedicated instances you use across any different instance type, it's a one fee per the entire region. Customers might be interested in this if you're, say, for example, in a financial services industry and have tight requirements around single tenant hosts. I'm also going to show you ways that you can migrate your licenses using dedicated instances. The final concept we're going to talk about is a dedicated host. A dedicated host is single tenant, and again, that means it belongs to one AWS account, and you the customer, determine when you launch an instance which host to place that instance on. In this case, you're going to pay per host per hour. So why did I go through all of that? Let's go through it and see what that means for bringing your own licenses. So the default tenancy, again, that's your multi-tenant host. Let's see what licenses you can bring to with Microsoft to that multi-tenant host. So the first thing to know is the only time you can bring a Microsoft license to that default or multi-tenant instance is if you have software assurance. Software assurance gives you license mobility to bring your own Microsoft application to an EC2 instance. So examples of this would be bringing your own SQL Server, your remote desktop services, Exchange, SharePoint, Dynamics, and System Center. We do not recommend that you bring Windows Server, Windows Desktop, or Microsoft Office to a default tenant. So how does this work? you're going to have, first of all, when you're going to bring that license to default tenants, you're going to select an EC2, Amazon EC2 instance type with the license included Windows Server Omni. And then on top of that, you are going to bring your own application with the license mobility. So in this case, it might be SQL Server. So you're going to get the EC2 instance from AWS that includes Windows Server, but then bring your own SQL Server license. The same can be said for SQL Server now that it's on Linux. You can choose an EC2 instance with Linux, and then bring your own SQL Server license and image for SQL Server for Linux. The advantage, so why would you want to do this, is that some of you may already have those SQL Server licenses, and perhaps you've got that through a generous volume customer or enterprise agreement discount. So you can still retain that SQL Server pricing and bring that license over to the shared tenancy. Okay, so now let's talk about when you would use that dedicated tenancy. I'm going to skip over the dedicated instance because most customers are going to find a dedicated host is going to suit their needs. So let's go over when you would want to use a dedicated host. Recall that a dedicated host is when a single customer account is entitled to the entire host. So you're buying the host, the entire host, all the instances on the host for the hour. The advantage of this is it meets Microsoft licensing requirements to bring your Windows Server license to the public cloud. And this allows you to bring any Microsoft application as well as the Windows Server license to the cloud. In this case, the really interesting part is you can also bring any application regardless of whether you have software assurance. It does not require software assurance, and you do not need license mobility. Of course, you may have that, but you're not required. Dedicated hosts are also really nice for maximizing Windows Data Center Edition with SQL Server Enterprise. So on a dedicated host where you have many instances, you can bring your Windows Data Center Edition license, and all of a sudden, all of those instances are now covered. All the instances you place on this one dedicated host are covered under the maximum virtualization benefits of Windows Data Center Edition. You can also then bring only the number of SQL Server Enterprise Edition licenses that you need for those instances. You can also, when you have dedicated hosts, bring your MSDN licenses to this environment. When you're using dedicated hosts, you are of course going to be bringing your own Windows Server license and code. So one of our customers, Deltek, has experienced significant annual savings when they used EC2 dedicated hosts and their Microsoft Enterprise Edition SQL Server licenses. Using the dedicated hosts, they were able to save at least 15% on their SQL licensing costs. I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to reach out to your Amazon account representative or email us at microsoft@amazon.com for more information. One final note I'll say is that you can always architect to use both BYOL for some of your applications where they're pretty static. Maybe you have a database that's quite static and you do not need the elastic benefits of the cloud as much. You can use BYOL for that, and then use license included for the type of applications where you really want to be very elastic, taking advantage of auto scaling and take advantage of not having to plan out and over purchase the number of Windows Server or SQL Server licenses for that elastic workload. So that's a great way to optimize your spending for Microsoft licenses. So we've gone over a lot of information today on Microsoft software, our licensing. We have great quick starts that can help you go through the migration that Michael went through. And then, of course, if you have any other questions on Microsoft licensing or any questions at all about bringing your workloads, Windows workloads to AWS, please feel free to send us an email to microsoft@amazon.com. Before we end, I want to talk to you about our Windows Rapid Migration Program. Together with the AWS, Microsoft, and migration competency partners, as well as our new AWS Service Delivery Designated Partners, we're offering you the ability to migrate one Windows workload with a 5-day engagement led by one of these partners. We'll provide a flat rate POC, and you can leverage some of the quick starts and our AWS ProServe delivery kits and the help of our AWS partner to quickly try out bringing across your first application to AWS. Once you have that applications over there, we also help with for Windows workloads on your first application with some Rethink credits. These credits will help you realize your ROI on that migration much more quickly. So contact your AWS partner or account manager for more information about the Windows Rapid Migration Program. My name is Jill Stoddart, and I appreciate you spending time today. Thank you very much.